Everybody, it is 12 o'clock and we are ready to begin. Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Toon. I'm the Communications Director for the League of Oregon Cities, filling in this week for Patty Mulvihill, who is visiting with our member cities on the South Coast. Want to welcome everybody to today's legislative webinar, as we're now into our second month of the legislative session. Before we start, some housekeeping issues. First, if you have not done so, please make sure your microphone is muted. Secondly, we aim to end this webinar promptly at 1 o'clock. Also, if you haven't already done so, please update your screen name to include the city that you represent. There are instructions for how to do that in the chat. A lot of information to cover and provide for you today. We will do our best to move through that quickly so that we can get to your questions at the end of a presentation by our staff lobbyists. Here's what we're going to cover on this week's call. We're going to start with House Bill 3644, which would create a programmatic approach at the state level to funding homeless shelters. Next, we'll dive into House Bill 3031, the governor's infrastructure for housing bill. That'll be followed by Senate Bill 427, which would expose current certified water rights to costly litigation. From there, we'll move to Senate Bill 619. This is the legislation that will allow workers in a labor dispute to collect unemployment. We'll follow that with our first report on a top priority for the LOC and its members this session, recreational immunity. And finally, we'll close our update segment with the latest on wildfire hazard mapping. Specifically, you'll hear about a letter to the legislature sent by Governor Kotek this week, which has effectively paused the regulatory framework until after this session. So that's your preamble, your intro to everything we're going to cover today. Other reminders, because of the volume of information that we need to present, we're going to hold all questions until the end of the presentations. If you have a question, please raise your Zoom hand or type your question in the chat feature. Myself, other staff will do our best to make sure we note who raised their hands or posed their questions first. And so let's begin. And to take us through each of these bills and introduce our lobbyists, I'm going to turn it over to LOC Legislative Director Jim McCauley and his team. Jim, take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. Kevin mentioned we're a month into this session. March is around the corner, which also means that our first set of bill deadlines are coming up here in about a month. So March 21st is first chamber deadline origin, which effectively means if you don't have a policy bill that has gone through that chamber, it is effectively dead. I think as all lobbyists look at some of these deadlines, they're good news and bad news. Good news is that your bill list starts to narrow a bit. The bad news is you potentially can lose a bill. So this next 30 days is really kind of pivotal for making sure that your advocacy gets stepped up. You're taking the opportunity with some of our measure alerts to reach out to your legislators and continue to provide that constant, consistent message, and as well as advocacy here. With that kind of as a starting point, I think the other thing to let people know is, at the front end of this session, we started out with little over 2,200 bills. I think we're just shy of around 3,000 bills right now that we're tracking. Again, that complicates things for us as we're reading through things and trying to figure out what bills are going to move and what bills are not going to move. So for today, as Kevin mentioned, we've got a few things to focus on. I'm going to have Alexandra Ring, who is our housing, homelessness, and land use lead, talk about House Bill 3644. This is the governor's shelter program. So with that, Alexandra, why don't you lead folks through the conversation on this, and we'll go forward.
Hey there, folks. As Jim introduced me, I'm Alexandra Ring. I cover our housing and land use portfolio here at the League. I'm here to talk to you today about HB 3644. Many of you may have tracked conversations over the summer with Representative Marsh and the governor's office regarding the creation of a new statewide shelter framework. over the past couple of years, the state had started investing dollars in shelter systems unlike ever before. But there's really been no kind of coordinated effort as to how those shelter dollars are invested. Each separate investment by year has kind of had its own framework, its own eligibility, its own uses. And this is really part of a broader effort to consolidate those efforts and to create a more streamlined, well understood system to fund shelters in our state. Most of it is not unexpected. Previously eligible shelters will continue to be eligible for state funding. I think the exciting thing for many of our members is the STEP program, and I cannot do STEP off the top of my head, so you will have to excuse. It's an acronym for something. But that is to allow vehicular shelters and those like pod shelters, tiny home villages, Conestoga huts, whatever your locality may call them, to be eligible for state funding. That's very exciting. A huge shout out to City of Eugene for leading the charge on getting that included in our new statewide shelter framework. Included in this package is also $217 million to continue to finance our shelter system here as a state. LOC will be promoting kind of 217 as a floor, not a ceiling in terms of funding, knowing that that only accounts for previously state funded shelters and does not account for any shelters that cities may be operating that will now be eligible for funding. This bill will be up in House Housing on Monday at 1 p.m. LOC and others will be submitting testimony. We encourage your localities to submit testimony on why this is important to you as well. And that's it for me.
Question, Alexandra. So would it be helpful for those cities who've got active shelters to be sharing some of their own stories in part of their testimony as well as their outreach?
Yeah, if you've got a shelter that would become, thank you, Kevin, for getting the STEP definition for me. It's not one that I've memorized quite yet. Yes, if you have stories of, shelters that your city is operating that will now be eligible for funding, or, I will say personal narratives are always very much appreciated, kind of attesting to why shelter dollars are needed, why these are so vital to our communities. Those are always very much appreciated, and legislators always like seeing the human side of what they're doing. I'll put my contact information in the chat as well.
Okay, super. Thank you very much for that. And I've also linked the bill in the chat for folks. So we're going to pivot just slightly. This is going to be really kind of the governor's infrastructure bill for housing, and I'll let Michael provide some comments on that and see if we have any additional gaps to fill in. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, afternoon, everyone. Michael Martin, manage the league's water, wastewater, natural resources, and solid waste portfolio. As Jim said, the governor's housing bill is up for a hearing next Wednesday at 1 p.m. And as soon as that's posted, folks will be able to provide comment, but we have gone through a process that on providing feedback on the -1 amendments and sending those to the governor's office and the chair of the committee. And that is a team effort. So thank you everybody who's provided feedback on the -1. The high level here is that this creates a new program for housing infrastructure. That is a good thing. We are supportive of that. However, we do have some unresolved conflicts that we want to work through, and we think some of those details should be worked out in rule with Business Oregon. We've been asked to plan a panel for this hearing on Wednesday, and just would encourage you all, if you want to provide feedback. I actually already see I'm getting some emails about this, so thanks for reaching out. I'll follow up with everyone, but we are supportive of infrastructure funding for housing, and yeah, this hearing's coming up.
Hey, Michael, quick question. Is it fair to say that kind of the top end message on this is really supportive of what the governor is after, seeing another $100 million come into the system, and then we can work out the details?
Yeah, yes, that is like what we are supportive. This is a step in the right direction in terms of infrastructure funding for needed housing. Like we all know, and I've heard from so many of you, infrastructure cited as one of the main barriers in housing. So, yep, supportive and want to give that feedback that's helpful to moving that conversation forward.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much for that. So we're going to keep you in the same queue here because we've got another bill for you to talk about. This is the certified water rights concerns that we've got with Senate Bill 427. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we're on the flip side here. So this is a governor's bill that we are opposing, and we're going to be submitting a letter to that end with other water user stakeholders. And the high level here is that with the constraints on groundwater and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife applying for in-stream water rights, a lot of times in terms of water rights and transfers is our only ability. So what does this mean in terms of like real world is if this bill were to pass and you want to seismically upgrade a point of diversion, intake for a water system, this would effectively add another layer of review, which could add to litigation and costly legal battles just simply for needing to do a small upgrade there. So there's some details in the bulletin on this. I've shared a letter that we wrote with a coalition, so you should be able to see that. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can reach back. But this bill is also scheduled for a hearing. It's on Tuesday, the 25th. And it's open now, but we are strongly opposed to this bill and actively engaging on this.
Great. Thanks very much. So next up, we're going to go with Scott Winkles, who's general government portfolio, and it covers a whole breadth of different issues that you face on a day-to-day basis. So Scott, the floor is yours with Senate Bill 619. This is the unemployment. Thank you. Unemployment benefits for striking workers.
Good afternoon, everyone. We've been talking about this bill for a while. We've sent out alerts on it, and I think there's even been some media coverage on this bill. So here's where we're at. So I'll summarize the bill. What it does, as written, is it would allow persons who aren't working due to a labor dispute to receive unemployment benefits. The way unemployment benefits work, there's a 1-week waiting period. And then people are allowed to collect a portion of their what would have been their wages. I think the maximum benefit right now is $890-ish, and the minimum benefit is $196. You as public employers don't pay an employment tax. What public employers do in almost every instance is they replenish the employment fund, so they pay a dollar for dollar for what is for a separated worker. Their benefits, so you just essentially pay whatever they're getting in a dollar for dollar. I believe it's a quarterly billing plan. The bill is very problematic from the perspective of the League of Oregon Cities. Cities really haven't had a strike in a very long time. We think nothing over. We can't find an instance, at least in my time at the league, which is getting close to 20 years, of someone going out for more than a few hours. The concern we have with the bill is that it reduces the amount of risks labor would have going into labor negotiations. So if they have, right now, the way the Public Employee Collective Bargaining Act is structured, it's designed so everybody has risk going into the conversation. So everybody's motivated to solve it before things get out of hand and people walk. So if you saw a bargaining unit up in Portland a couple weeks ago, they got to the eve of the strike. They were just within a few hours, and they settled. And that's the system working. And so what we think will happen is we'll have more strikes among public employers if this happens and disrupts services. And so if we're looking at scenarios where if your public works goes out and you need a repair, your city could go on a boil notice. You're talking about being unable to address, road place hazards, these sorts of things. For counties, I think it gets quite dire when you start talking about people doing child support payments or WIC and TANF benefits going out. Huge impacts. I just got off the phone with a legislator before I joined this call, and that legislator is a no. But what she's hearing from what they're hearing from friends in the caucus is that they're not hearing enough from the public employers. So I just implore you, if you haven't reached out to your senators, state senators, and especially if they're in the majority caucus, if they're in the Democratic caucus, explain to them the impacts this bill will have to you and the financial strains you're under. I think we are getting traction on this. We've gotten into a position where we believe we have to negotiate because we don't think we have the votes. Well, we know we don't have the votes to stop it on the floor. If it gets there, so we have offered the management, which is public and private, have offered a 3-week waiting period prior to going to strike, prior to receiving unemployment benefits, and a removal of the emergency clause. So the bill wouldn't take effect until January 1st, as opposed to on the governor's signature. That offer was rebuffed in negotiations, but I think it's important that legislators know that we showed up to the table in good faith, and we got rejected. So again, reach out to me. I'm going to put my work cell in the chat. If you need to talk to me over the weekend, please do so. I can't stress enough the importance of city leaders weighing in with their senators on this important bill, particularly if they're in the majority caucus in the Senate. So, and I'm sure there'll be questions, and we'll save those to the end.
Scott, let me have a quick follow-up on this. I mean,
Sure.
I know you stressed the importance of having people reach out. I mean, the scale of the importance here is like they need to reach out today. Is that pretty fair?
Today, if your members are doing town halls this weekend, that would be great. If you have cell phone privileges with them, use those. But today, very soon, the bill's already had one public hearing and an informational meeting. We think there might be an additional public hearing. We know there's an amendment coming to fix the definition of labor dispute. So there's a little bit of time, but not much. So really hope you can, I really hope you can make those contacts in the next few hours.
Great, thanks for that. So you've got the next one as well. This is Senate Bill 179, recreational immunity.
Okay, well, now we'll have good news. The Senate Bill 179 is the recreational immunity fix. The bill was up in Senate Judiciary this week for its first public hearing. The bill, what essentially the bill does is it makes permanent the recreational immunity fix that we got in the short session. Is it everything we asked for? No, but it does fix the immediate issues, and it does let us keep the trails open. And so that's where we're at. It was supported by the league. Testifying in support was City County Insurance Services. What was important to the committee to hear was that the fix would in fact keep the trails and those services open, and we think it does that. So good news. I think we're in pretty good shape on that bill. So looking forward to that bill going through. I think if you're having, I'm not going to put on an alert on it. I don't think that's necessary right now, given the weight of some of the other issues we're talking about. But if you are talking to your senators, I think including that in your messaging and encouraging a little positive reinforcement there would be great. So good hearing. Got some token opposition from OTLA, but that's I'm sorry, the Oregon Trial Lawyers Association, but that's about it. They didn't do the full court press on it, so that's good.
Good news is always helpful for these conversations on Fridays. A lot of times I think our focus is on almost kind of a hair on fire at this point, but good news is always good news, and hopefully we'll make sure that this thing keeps moving forward during the rest of the session. So the last piece falls on me here. This is really kind of an update on the wildfire hazard maps. So I'll just say in general, the Department of Forestry as well as Oregon State University has been working on a hazard map for literally the last 4 years, ever since Senate Bill 762 passed the 21 session. The whole point of these hazard maps was to be able to lay out various scales of hazard or risk across the landscape for communities, for landowners, and the regulatory overlay for this work really came down to whether or not your property was in a wildland urban interface, which is another delineation itself, and whether or not the scale of risk on that property was significant enough that warranted basically a change in practices, largely two pieces. One was making sure that you had defensible space around buildings. One of the more common programs that's out there is Firewise. It's been around for several decades, and it's a pretty standard protocol that's used across the Western United States for thinning and like I said, making sure that you've got defensible space around buildings. The other piece on this was home hardening, and that effectively came down to building designs and changing what those structures physically looked at and how they were, I'll just say, using air intake as a simple technical measure when you're building a home or a building. So if you look at the fires that took place down in California here recently, a number of the buildings or a number of the homes that actually survived those had passive ventilation systems that essentially prevented embers from coming into the building and then burning from the inside out, plus also a number of other products on the outside shell of the building. So where we're at right now is there was a new map that was released first part of January. There's roughly 106,000 acres out of the entire millions of acres identified in the state that present hazard or risk of fire. And the governor's office, as a result of some, I'll just say, landowner input into this process, a lot of concerns from citizens about whether there was a way to get their land out of it because they didn't feel it belonged in. I'll just say bottom line at this point, while the Department of Forestry is still going to be collecting appeals, which is certainly allowed for in this process, they are not going to be going through the administrative process of evaluating that until session is over with. And we perhaps get some a little bit more direction out of the legislature and out of the governor's office on what we're going to do with these hazard maps in the future. So the other part of this is, where do cities fall into this framework? Because the whole point of putting this hazard map together was to have a statewide standard, was to effectively require how homes were going to be built in these hazard areas in the future, using what's referred to as an R327 guideline. Again, that's the home hardening component. It's part of a national standard, but also get into that defensible space place. I expect the outcome of this to potentially fall on local governments. So cities and counties would have the opportunity to adopt these guidelines in the future, perhaps using these statewide maps as overall guidance. But a lot of that has yet to be determined at this point. I think the reason I'm flagging this right now is to be aware. We're going to continue to have these conversations going forward this session, and to try to figure out what the role of local government is going to be on this regulatory approach going forward. So again, a little bit of unknown at this point. An awful lot of work has already been put forward into this mapping process. It's not perfect. There's no question. There's some areas that need to see some improvement, and that's honestly what part of this appeals process is for. ODF has received about 200 landowner appeals at this point. And going forward, probably expect to see a few more out of this process. So we're going to have to wait until the legislature's had a chance to fully evaluate this conversation at this point. But again, I definitely see the potential that the implementation for this is potentially going to be falling on local governments down the road. So with that, that's the full slate of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And definitely want to open this up to questions for the remainder of our time.
Got a little bit over a half an hour. I'm just going to look to the chat and see what we have. The only thing I'm seeing right now, Jim, and I think this is for Scott, and I do see a hand raised now from the city of Beaverton, but I did see this one in the chat, and I believe it's about Scott's Bill 916 from the city of Tualatin. The question is there any compelling data that maybe we can share that contradicts the argument? The point being, this person saying the pushback that they received was that there was not evidence of an increased level of strikes from other states that have enacted similar policies. Scott, any thoughts you want to share on that?
Oh, yes, there are. First, the two states that have enacted this are New York and New Jersey, and they've enacted those policies very recently. I will also note that New York and New Jersey have something on the books called Taylor's Law, which makes it very difficult for public employees to go out on strike. And so that there's data showing that this doesn't lead to greater labor unrest and greater strikes it's not there. I think we're going into an area where that's uncharted. So for the proponents of the bill to say that there's no data, well, I mean, I just don't know how they get there, and frankly, if that's the case, then I'm not sure why they're balking at the negotiations and the offers. I mean, if you invite someone in and you say you're going to negotiate, and your stance remains no. I mean, that's a problem. So sorry, I'm getting a little hot about this, but this one is the lobbying on this one has been fairly intense.
We've done this enough, Scott. We know what we're asking for when we put you in the Q&A segment, so no worries.
Fair enough.
Scott, reminder to everybody, Scott's information is in the chat if you want to communicate with him directly. I want to move next to the question from Jocelyn Blake of Beaverton. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Jocelyn, and ask your question.
Hey, thanks. Michael, I have a couple water questions, and I think someone asked it in the chat too. Can you send out the 3031 comment letters so we have specifics around the improvements that we're looking for in the -1?
Yes.
Okay. And my second one, and we can talk offline if needed, but on the water rights bill, it's my understanding that it only applies if you're going to transfer a water right or move the water right out of the original basin. Is that correct? Like if we just did a seismic update, but didn't move the point source, that the bill does not apply.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jocelyn. And two, I want to take an opportunity to kind of clarify something. So this was a request of the Oregon Water Partnership. To clarify something earlier, is we actually met with the governor's office yesterday, a lot of things happening. Met with the governor's office yesterday on this. My understanding is that it does apply to all like in any time there would be a transfer, as that if in that transfer resulting in diminishing stream flow. So I think the concern there is that as we become more constrained in terms of like what's happening with groundwater and ODF&W applying for in-stream water rights, is that if this is the only process we have, you know, be it a point of diversion or the example I used, I was thinking of the city of Ashland, that if you apply for that transfer, it it is going to add another layer where there could be litigation in utilizing a transfer. I hope that answers the question.
That's helpful. Yes, thank you so much.
All right, Jocelyn, thanks for your question. I'm going to move back to the chat from Kelly Hart from the city of Lebanon. I'll read her question. House Bill 3031, if providing testimony, what is some supportive feedback, but also helpful feedback to advocate for the greatest leniency in connection to housing to support whole system infrastructure improvements, or to advocate for a wide definition of infrastructure related to housing? Michael, that's in your portfolio.
Yeah, appreciate the question. I think, you know, as Jim had asked again at the top, is we are supportive of infrastructure funding. I think right now, and you know, to Jocelyn's question too, I'll provide the initial feedback that we've given is right now. I mean, in short, we have sort of effectively believe that it's a little too narrow and too restrictive in some of the comments and in some of the goals, but that if we could have that discussion outside, you know, with Business Oregon and Rule, that there would be an opportunity to, one, you know, meet the goals that we need. We need more housing and have the infrastructure funding program to do that work. So I can follow up with you directly, Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Let's continue in the chat from Tanya Graham from the city of Ashland. Can the LLC send out information about Taylor's Law so we can offer that? Seems the legislature should hang tight and watch how this plays out in these other states. Scott?
Yeah, we'll be sending out an updated alert after this call. It'll include the sort of the distinctions between the Washington or the New York, New Jersey law. I also saw in the chat something about Washington. Actually, that bill is 5041. It is still going through the legislative process in Washington. It hasn't passed. It is not law yet. So there was a plan by Labor to have the hearings on bills in Oregon, Washington, and California all on the same day. That didn't really pan out. But the Washington law is not in effect. Yeah, it's just got referred to their Ways and Means Committee.
Thank you, Scott. Let's see here. There's another question in the chat. Can you give examples of what specifically is restrictive of the current housing infrastructure package? I think that might be Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. You know, I think the criteria, you know, without getting into much, is like the criterion we want to get the criterion definitions right. And we want to structure you know, what we're going to be pushing for is that we structure the program as a way to have housing and infrastructure, the goals that this bill has set forward in rules. So some of that's connected to affordability, but we want to, you know, maybe make sure that there's some scoring criteria for capacity, affordability, diversity, and then sort of the wide range of cities' needs when it comes to infrastructure for housing.
Okay, thank you. We'll continue here in a moment. Scott just texted me. He said he wanted to clarify some information that's in the chat. Scott, are you still with us?
I did. We're good, Kevin. That was in
Okay.
relation to that Washington statute.
Gotcha. Okay, very good. I see a question on a topic we haven't covered today, but I think Jenna Jones is on, and that's from Mayor Cross of the city of Toledo. Is there any update on transit lodging tax?
Yeah, so I think last week we talked about the LOC bill, which is House Bill 56 or 3556. I'll put it in the chat after I make these remarks. It's currently sitting in the House Emergency Management, General Government, and Veterans Committee. The Coastal Caucus is going to ask that bill be referred. It has a subsequent referral to House Revenue, that they work the bill without recommendation and move it over to Revenue as soon as possible so we can have conversations about the policy there, since the Revenue Committee knows a lot about it. I will say that on the TLT front, there is a bill up on Monday in the House Economic Development and Small Business Committee, House Bill 2977. This is a state transient lodging tax bill that would increase the tax to go towards conservation. This only applies to the state TLT. I've gotten a couple of questions from folks this week about it. We are just monitoring that bill, and we'll likely use it as a reason why locals should be able to tailor our statutes to what we'd like to do with our lodging taxes if the state continues to play around with their tax. So that's what's happening now. Hopefully in the next week, we'll see movement on House Bill 3556 and can give you some good news, and we can start having people sign up for House revenue.
Sounds good, Jenna. Thank you. Looks like Kelly Hart has another question about a bill I don't think we covered today. House Bill 2830. Jim, are you familiar?
I just actually saw it and I'm pulling it up. It's right in front of me right here. So I think we've seen this one in years past. So if I'm not mistaken, this would prohibit a local government, contracting agency, blah, 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 from enforcing any kind of an ordinance that prohibits or restricts or limits the evaluation of pipe or piping materials. I think this historically has been something that we have certainly fought because we don't want the state to basically tell local governments how to basically determine what type of piping materials we need to be using in water facilities. The last thing we want to do is get constrained to, we'll say, using plastic pipe and then find out later it's going to burn up and turn into basically toxic goo. So this has not had success in years past, but I don't have I'll say a physical update for you on whether or not it's going to actually get a hearing. It certainly isn't scheduled for anything right now. And this becomes kind of a placeholder that we've seen in years past.
All right. And thank you, Jim. Just going to scroll the chat. Not seeing any new questions, but I do see Peter Hall, you have your hand raised, so please proceed.
Yes, this has to do with the wildfire maps. Now, is there in residents in the high-risk areas, would there be any funding available to them for wildfire mitigation?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Peter. That's the kind of the other part of this story is we've been after, some stable resources or essentially revenue out there to help support communities and homeowners with getting their properties basically in a position where you have that reduced fire hazard. And when you look at the amount of money that we actually had coming into the system after 21 with some of the federal money, there were, well, a little over $100 million of funding came through the system and did an awful lot of great work on the resilience side of things in grants that went out to communities. So part of this wildfire conversation right now is developing that, I'll say, stable long-term source of revenue. I've been sitting on a wildfire gap funding work group since the middle of the summer. What we have highlighted in the bulletin report in the bulletin this week is also a link to that report. There are a number of revenue options that are potentially available, none of which are going to be an easy sell to the legislature because many of them include redirecting some general fund money. But bottom line with this gap funding is we're trying to come up with roughly $260 million of additional funding for Department of Forestry, as well as State Fire Marshal's office. And a good share of that would be going to the resilience piece, providing grant funds for individuals, for communities to basically help deal with some of that fireproofing, both in the kind of the landscape or on the ground, but also provide some funding for improving current buildings and things of that nature.
Thank you, Peter. Scott, I'm going to bring you back up for Diana Moffitt's question about whether there's an update on a bill regarding failure to submit union dues.
Yeah, so the bill is 2944. There was a hearing. What it does is it would, well, as written, it would require the Employment Relations Board to impose fines of 5,000, starting at 5,000 to $10,000 to employers who don't turn over employment rosters and or dues collected on behalf of the union. Current the way collective bargaining works, someone opts into the union, the employer deducts those wages and sends them to the union. The employer gets I think there's an administrative fee on those. The bill is, I mean, it's largely unnecessary. All of this is resolved through the contract. We can't find a whole lot of instances where an employer actually intentionally withheld or did not remit the union dues in a timely manner. Among our membership, but I'm not saying it hasn't happened. It's just if it has, it's rare. I think there were some cities that were hit with cybercrime, that were hit with natural disasters, that did probably get behind. There's some conversations on the bill. I think we'll see some amendments coming to protect employers who are suffering from extenuating circumstances, and then give IRB some actual discretion in the bill. I don't know what the prospects are of the conversation. I think it gets out of committee if we don't come to the table on it. So that's kind of where we're at.
All right. This one, actually, I don't know that everyone can see it because it looks like it came directly to me. And it's from the city of Madras. And this probably is for Alexandra regarding this shelter bill. They're asking, is there a focus on cities that have a shelter, or is it focused on cities that need to build a shelter?
It's focused on cities that have shelters. So to be clear, this does not account for building new shelter beds. It does not have any kind of capital funding to, purchase facility or anything like this. This is purely focused on sustaining the shelter beds that we currently have. I think there was a conversation about what it would take to build more shelter beds. And I think part of the challenge there is that we are in an incredibly constrained budget environment. And, this is already a package of 217 million, which is a huge chunk of change for the state even. And so, when it comes to considering what it would take to build more shelter, which I don't think there's any denying is needed, it gets a little trickier. I know certainly that there are, parties out there who are interested in shelter funding, kind of on top of what is being asked for by the governor, to build new shelter beds. But at this time, it's not something that the league is pursuing. We're really kind of trying to pursue the 217 and kind of the support of a little bit above that to include shelter beds that cities are currently funding out of their own coffers that have not historically been eligible. It's a tough situation though.
All right, questions are continuing, and I'm not sure where this one's going to go. So Jim, give me some guidance maybe here. Can we provide an update on House Bill 3634 regarding the development of a skilled water infrastructure / public works workforce?
Yeah, this certainly falls on Michael's portfolio. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, for the question. This is one of the league's top 9 priorities going into this session. As everyone knows, we like toilets that flush and clean drinking water to come out of the tap. And that is a huge workforce challenge for our members to find qualified operators, and will continue to be so over the next decade with increased retirements. So we've narrowed in on this workforce challenge that we're trying to meet, and thankful to the Water Caucus in the state legislature. They had put this bill in their list of bills for the water package. Senate, it will be heard we've been promised a hearing, I believe, on March 4th in the Higher Ed Committee. So thank you, Rep. Hudson, for that. And as soon as it's posted, I'll kind of let everybody know, but I'll post it for a hearing. I'll let everybody know, but we're supportive of this. Isn't this going to help address some of those workforce challenges?
Okay, thank you, Michael. We are at about quarter till the hour, and I'm not seeing any more questions or hands raised, so I think we're going to wrap it up. Just a couple reminders. Please join us every Friday at noon during legislative session for these updates on the latest happenings at the Capitol. And I also wanted to just offer one final promotional message. If you are planning to attend the LOC's upcoming spring conference in North Bend, that's May 1st and 2nd, we had more than 100 registrations within the first couple of days of putting out or opening registration. So I'm told we are rapidly approaching a sellout. So if you are planning to attend, I strongly encourage you to register today. There is basically limited space. And if you want to attend, time is now to sign up. There is a link to register for that event on our homepage. Without further ado, before we close, Jim raised his hand, so we're going to let him have the final word.
Great. Thanks for that, Kevin. Hey, I just want to update folks. The question came up about our comments or the league's comments on this infrastructure bill from the governor's office. That again is House Bill 3031. We're going to update the bulletin article today with actually our testimony as well as a link to the amendment for folks to be able to follow up on. So that'll get you the details, and that'll get you the details of where you can focus in your comments. So I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Jim. And somebody asked for a link to the event, and there it is going in the chat right now. So there, you should be able to click on that link to register for the spring conference. So that wraps it up for our webinar update for today, February 21st. We'll be back again next Friday at noon. Everybody have a great weekend. Thank you.